The studio lights burned bright, casting a dramatic glow over the sleek set of a primetime television debate, where two political heavyweights were about to clash over the contentious issue of tax reform and economic policy. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind that only a live broadcast could generate, as viewers across the nation tuned in to witness what was billed as a defining moment in political discourse. At the center of it all was Senator John Kennedy, the sharp-witted Republican from Louisiana, known for his folksy charm and razor-sharp rhetoric. Across from him sat Senator Elizabeth Warren, the Massachusetts Democrat, whose reputation as a fierce advocate for financial reform preceded her. The stage was set for a battle of ideas, but what unfolded would be far more than a policy discussion. It would be a masterclass in strategy preparation and the art of commanding an audience. Kennedy, with his unassuming demeanor and knack for distilling complex issues into plain-spoken truths, was ready to take on Warren, whose reliance on intricate data and academic arguments often left audiences struggling to keep up. This was no ordinary debate. It was a high-stakes showdown that would test the limits of both senators' skills and set the tone for an unforgettable confrontation. The program, a flagship production of a major cable news network, had been hyping this event for weeks. Promotional teasers flashed across screens, promising a no-holds-barred debate on tax policy, with bold graphics pitting Kennedy's name against Warren's, in a way that suggested gladiatorial combat rather than a policy discussion. Behind the scenes, the production team buzzed with energy, their headsets crackling with last-minute instructions as camera operators adjusted angles to capture every nuance of the impending clash. The audience, a mix of political enthusiasts and casual viewers, filled the studio with an electric hum, their murmurs rising as the host introduced the evening's main event. "Tonight we dive into the heart of America's economic future," the host declared, his voice booming with practiced gravitas. Senator John Kennedy, a staunch defender of fiscal conservatism, faces off against Senator Elizabeth Warren, a champion of progressive reform. Buckle up. This is going to be a ride. The crowd erupted in applause, some cheering for Kennedy's common-sense approach, others for Warren's fiery advocacy. But beneath the surface, the real drama was brewing in the preparation rooms where both senators had spent days honing their strategies. John Kennedy, with his trademark wit and Southern drawl, had approached the debate with meticulous care. His team of advisors, a seasoned group of political operatives, had drilled him on every possible angle Warren might take. They knew her playbook, a barrage of statistics, detailed policy proposals, and moral arguments about economic inequality. Kennedy's strategy was different. He didn't need to match Warren's academic rigor. Instead, he aimed to connect with the average viewer, the hard-working Americans who didn't have time for wonky jargon. His advisors had pored over Warren's past debates, noting her tendency to overwhelm opponents, with data often losing the audience in the process. Kennedy's plan was to keep things simple, direct, and relatable, using his gift for memorable one-liners to cut through Warren's dense arguments. In the days leading up to the debate, he'd practiced delivering sharp, concise rebuttals, each one designed to resonate with viewers at home. "Folks don't want a lecture," he told his team during a late-night strategy session. "They want someone who talks like they do, who gets their struggles." His advisors nodded, knowing that Kennedy's ability to distill complex issues into plain talk was his greatest weapon. Elizabeth Warren, on the other hand, had prepared with the intensity of a scholar facing a dissertation defense. Her team, a group of policy wonks and communication experts, had compiled binders filled with charts, graphs, and economic studies to support her case for sweeping tax reforms. Warren's goal was clear: to expose what she saw as the flaws in conservative tax policies that favored the wealthy. She'd spent hours rehearsing her talking points, refining her delivery to balance passion with precision. Her team had warned her about Kennedy's style, his knack for disarming opponents with humor and bluntness. But Warren was confident. She believed her command of the facts and her moral clarity would carry the day. "If I can lay out the numbers," she told her advisors, "the truth will speak for itself." But there was a blind spot in her preparation. Warren's focus on data and policy minutiae often left her disconnected from audiences who craved simplicity over complexity. Her team had urged her to incorporate more relatable anecdotes, but Warren insisted on sticking to her strengths, hard evidence, and intellectual rigor. As she walked onto the set, her briefcase stuffed with notes, she exuded confidence, unaware that Kennedy was poised to exploit her weaknesses. The debate began with a question from the moderator about the impact of recent tax cuts on middle-class families. Warren seized the opportunity to launch into her argument, her voice steady and authoritative. "Let's talk about what's really happening." She began pulling out a stack of papers. The top 1% of earners have seen their tax burden drop by nearly 10%, while working families are still struggling to pay for childcare and health care. The numbers don't lie. IRS data from the past 3 years shows that corporate tax loopholes have ballooned, costing the Treasury billions that could fund public schools or infrastructure. She gestured emphatically, her eyes scanning the audience as if daring them to disagree. The crowd listened intently, but there was a subtle shift in the room, a restlessness among viewers who found her barrage of statistics overwhelming. Warren pressed on, citing a study from a prominent think tank that projected long-term deficits from unchecked tax breaks. Her delivery was polished, her facts unimpeachable, but the complexity of her argument began to alienate the less policy-savvy members of the audience. Kennedy, seated across from her, leaned back in his chair, his expression one of calm amusement. When it was his turn to respond, he didn't reach for a binder or a chart. Instead, he leaned forward, looked directly into the camera, and spoke as if addressing a neighbor over a backyard fence. "Now, I respect Senator Warren's passion for numbers," he said, his Louisiana drawl adding a touch of warmth to his words. "But let me tell you what I hear from folks back home. They're not sitting around their kitchen tables talking about IRS data or think tank studies. They're worried about gas prices, grocery bills, and whether they can afford to send their kids to college." The audience nodded, some chuckling at his folksy tone. Kennedy's words were simple, but they hit home, resonating with viewers who felt seen in a way Warren's lecture-style delivery couldn't match. He continued, "The tax cuts we're talking about put more money in the pockets of hard-working Americans. I've got a small business owner in Shreveport who told me he hired 2 new employees because of those cuts. That's not a statistic, that's real life." Warren's eyes narrowed slightly as Kennedy spoke, sensing the shift in the room. She'd expected him to engage with her data, but instead he was sidestepping it entirely, appealing directly to the audience's emotions. She interjected, trying to regain control. "Senator Kennedy, with all due respect, anecdotes don't outweigh evidence. The Congressional Budget Office projects a $1.9 trillion deficit increase over the next decade because of those tax cuts. How do you justify that to the American people?" Her tone was sharp, her words cutting, but Kennedy didn't flinch. He smiled, almost as if he'd been waiting for this moment. "Senator, I reckon the American people are tired of being lectured about deficits when they're just trying to make ends meet," he said, his voice steady but pointed. "You want to talk about justifying things? How do you justify proposing tax hikes that'll hit small businesses harder than Wall Street?" The crowd erupted in applause, particularly from those who'd come expecting Kennedy to hold his own. The exchange marked the first real flashpoint of the debate, a moment where the contrast between the two senators became starkly clear. Warren's reliance on data and policy details was beginning to backfire, making her seem out of touch with the everyday concerns of the audience. Kennedy, meanwhile, was playing to his strengths, using humor and plain language to deflect her attacks and keep the focus on relatable issues. The moderator, sensing the rising tension, tried to steer the conversation to a new question about corporate tax loopholes, but Warren was already on the defensive. She launched into another detailed explanation citing specific provisions in the tax code and their impact on income inequality. Section 119, for example, she said, allows pass-through entities to deduct 20% of their income, which disproportionately benefits high earners. Her words were precise, but the audience's eyes began to glaze over, and a few stifled yawns could be seen in the back rows. Kennedy seized the opportunity to double down. "Senator Warren, I don't know what a pass-through entity is, and I'd bet most folks watching at home don't either," he said, his tone light but cutting. "What they do know is that they're paying too much for groceries, and your plans to raise taxes ain't gonna make that easier." The crowd roared again, and Warren's frustration was becoming visible. She shifted in her seat, her hands gripping her notes a little tighter. She hadn't anticipated Kennedy's ability to turn her strength, her mastery of policy, into a liability. Her team had warned her about his knack for simplifying complex issues, but she'd underestimated how effectively he could use it to control the narrative. As the debate moved into its next phase, Warren tried to pivot, focusing on the moral case for her reforms. "This isn't just about numbers," she said, her voice rising with conviction. "It's about fairness, about making sure the system works for everyone, not just the wealthy." But Kennedy was ready for this too. "Fairness?" he shot back. "Fairness is letting folks keep more of what they earn, not sending it to Washington to get lost in some bureaucrat's desk." By now, the studio was buzzing with energy, the audience fully engaged in the back and forth. Social media was beginning to light up with reactions, with viewers praising Kennedy's ability to connect with them on a personal level. Comments like Kennedy's "speaking for the little guy" and "finally someone who gets it" flooded platforms, while Warren's supporters struggled to counter the growing narrative that she was out of touch. Behind the scenes, Warren's advisors watched nervously from the control room, realizing their candidate was losing ground. They'd prepared her for a policy debate, but Kennedy was turning it into a battle of perception, and he was winning. The moderator, sensing the need to keep things moving, called for a brief pause, allowing both senators to regroup. As the cameras panned away, Kennedy leaned back in his chair, a slight smile playing on his lips, while Warren flipped through her notes, her brow furrowed. The stage was set for an escalation, and Kennedy was poised to take full advantage of Warren's growing frustration. The first segment of the debate had already shown the stark contrast between the two senators. Kennedy's preparation, rooted in understanding the audience's priorities, was paying off, while Warren's reliance on technical arguments was faltering. The crowd could sense it, the viewers at home could feel it, and the producers knew they had a hit on their hands. But this was only the beginning. The real fireworks were yet to come, and Kennedy, with his unyielding focus and strategic brilliance, was ready to push Warren to her breaking point. The stage was his, and he wasn't about to let it go. The studio lights seemed to burn even hotter as the debate resumed, the air crackling with the kind of tension that only a live television showdown could produce. The audience, still buzzing from the opening round, leaned forward in their seats, sensing that the battle between Senator John Kennedy and Senator Elizabeth Warren was about to escalate. Kennedy, the Louisiana Republican, with a knack for plain-spoken brilliance, had already set the tone with his relatable no-nonsense responses, effortlessly connecting with viewers at home. Warren, the Massachusetts Democrat, known for her academic rigor, was struggling to regain her footing after Kennedy's sharp deflections had thrown her off balance. The moderator, A seasoned journalist with a flair for drama wasted no time diving into the next question, aiming to keep the energy high. "Senators, let's shift to corporate tax loopholes," he said, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. "Senator Warren, you've called for closing these loopholes to fund social programs. How do you respond to critics who say this will stifle economic growth?" The question was a softball for Warren, perfectly suited to her expertise, but Kennedy's piercing gaze suggested he was ready to turn her moment into his own. Warren straightened in her chair, her eyes flashing with determination as she launched into her response. "Thank you for the question." She began, her voice steady, but carrying an edge of urgency. Corporate tax loopholes are a scandal. They allow multinational corporations to dodge billions in taxes by exploiting offshore havens and deductions that the average American can't access. For example, the carried interest loophole lets hedge fund managers pay a lower tax rate than teachers or firefighters. My plan would close these gaps, raising over $800 billion in revenue over a decade, according to independent estimates. That money could fund healthcare, education, and infrastructure, things that actually help working families. She punctuated her points with sharp gestures, her notes neatly arranged in front of her, as if the sheer weight of her data could silence any opposition. The audience listened, some nodding in agreement, but others shifted uncomfortably, their eyes glazing over as Warren delved into the minutiae of tax code provisions. Her argument was airtight on paper, but it lacked the emotional punch needed to captivate a broader audience. Kennedy, leaning back with a relaxed posture that belied his razor-sharp focus, waited for his turn. When the moderator nodded to him, he didn't reach for notes or statistics. Instead, he leaned forward, his southern drawl cutting through the studio like a warm breeze. "Well now, Senator Warren's got a lot of numbers up her sleeve, and I respect that," he said, his tone friendly, but laced with a hint of mischief. "But let's talk plain English for a minute. Folks at home aren't sitting around crunching numbers on tax loopholes. They're trying to figure out how to pay their bills. The small businesses I talk to in Louisiana, mom-and-pop shops, family restaurants, they're not dodging taxes in the Cayman Islands. They're just trying to keep the lights on. And when you start talking about raising taxes on businesses, you're talking about taking money out of their pockets." The crowd erupted in applause, particularly from those who'd come to support Kennedy's common-sense approach. His words were simple, but they hit like a sledgehammer, resonating with viewers who felt Warren's lecture was disconnected from their daily struggles. Warren's face tightened, a flicker of frustration crossing her features. She hadn't expected Kennedy to sidestep her carefully constructed argument so effortlessly. She jumped in, her voice rising slightly. "Senator Kennedy, with all due respect, you're oversimplifying a complex issue. The data shows that 91 of the Fortune 100 companies paid zero federal taxes in at least 1 year over the past decade. That's not small businesses, that's corporate greed." She leaned forward, her hands gripping the edge of the desk, as if sheer intensity could reclaim the narrative. But Kennedy was ready. He tilted his head, a slight smile playing on his lips, and responded with a calm that only amplified his impact. "Senator, I don't doubt your numbers, but I reckon most folks would rather hear about how we're going to make their lives easier, not how we're going to chase down every last penny from big companies. You want to talk greed? How about the government's greed for taking more of what hard-working Americans earn?" The audience roared again, and Warren's composure began to crack her eyes, narrowing as she realized Kennedy was turning her expertise against her. The moderator, sensing the rising tension, tried to steer the conversation to a new angle. "Let's talk about job creation," he said. "Senator Warren, your critics say your tax proposals would discourage businesses from hiring. How do you address that?" Warren seized the opportunity to pivot, hoping to regain her footing. "That's a myth. pushed by those who benefit from the status quo, she said, her voice forceful. My plan incentivizes job creation by investing in infrastructure and green energy, which could create millions of jobs. Studies from the Economic Policy Institute show that every $100 billion in infrastructure spending creates 1.5 million jobs. This isn't about punishing businesses, it's about building an economy that works for everyone. She leaned back, satisfied with her response, but the audience's reaction was muted. Her reliance on studies and figures, while factually sound, was failing to connect with viewers who craved a more human touch. Kennedy pounced. Now, Senator Warren, you keep talking about studies and institutes, but let me tell you about a guy I met in Baton Rouge. He said, his voice warm and conversational. Runs a hardware store, been in his family for 3 generations. He told me, John, if you raise my taxes, I'm not hiring anybody new. I might have to let someone go. That's not a study, that's a real person. And I'd rather listen to him than a think tank in Washington. The crowd erupted again, and Kennedy's smile widened as he saw the impact of his words. Warren's frustration was now palpable, her hands fidgeting with her notes as she struggled to counter Kennedy's anecdotal prowess. She tried to interrupt, her voice sharp. Senator, anecdotes don't solve systemic problems. We need policies based on evidence, not stories. But Kennedy was relentless. Evidence is great, Senator, but it don't mean much if it's just a bunch of fancy words that don't help the folks I'm talking to every day. He shot back, his tone still calm, but cutting. The debate was now firmly in Kennedy's control, and the audience could feel it. Social media was lighting up with clips of his responses, with viewers tweeting phrases like Kennedy's killing it, and finally someone who talks like us. Warren's supporters, meanwhile, were scrambling to defend her, but their posts were drowned out by the wave of enthusiasm for Kennedy's plain-spoken style. Behind the scenes, Warren's advisors watched in dismay, their headsets buzzing with frantic discussions about how to pivot. They'd prepared her for a policy debate, but Kennedy was turning it into a performance, and he was stealing the show. Warren, sensing the shift, tried a new tactic, aiming to put Kennedy on the defensive. Senator Kennedy, your party's tax cuts have ballooned the deficit, and you've offered no plan to address it. How do you justify that to taxpayers? Her question was pointed, designed to expose a weakness, but Kennedy was unfazed. Senator, I'm glad you brought up the deficit. Kennedy said, his voice dripping with confidence. But let's be honest, folks at home don't lie awake at night worrying about the deficit. They're worrying about their mortgage, their kids' school, their grocery bills. Our tax cuts gave them a break, put more money in their pockets. Your plans? They're gonna send that money right back to Washington, where it'll get lost in a maze of bureaucracy. The crowd cheered wildly, and Warren's face flushed with frustration. She opened her mouth to respond, but Kennedy cut her off with a line that would become the defining moment of the night. Senator Warren, with all due respect, you're making this more complicated than it needs to be. Just hush for a second and let's talk sense. The studio fell silent for a split second, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Warren's eyes widened, her composure crumbling as she snapped back. Excuse me, did you just tell me to hush? Her voice was sharp, almost trembling with indignation, and the audience gasped, sensing the debate was about to explode. Kennedy leaned back, his expression calm but resolute. I did, Senator, because sometimes you gotta stop talking to start listening, he said, his tone firm but not malicious. The crowd erupted again, some cheering, others murmuring in shock at the audacity of his words. Warren, visibly shaken, tried to regroup. That kind of disrespect is exactly why we can't have productive discussions, she said, her voice rising as she pointed at Kennedy. You're dodging the issue with cheap shots instead of engaging with the facts. But her response only played into Kennedy's hands. He shook his head, a slight smile tugging at his lips. "Senator, I'm not dodging anything. I'm just trying to talk to the folks at home in a way they understand. You keep throwing out numbers like they're gonna solve everything, but people want answers, not lectures." The audience roared again, and Warren's frustration boiled over. She slammed her hand on the desk, her voice loud and unsteady. "This isn't about lectures. It's about truth. And you're refusing to face it." The studio was now a powder keg. The tension electric as the cameras zoomed in on Warren's flushed face and Kennedy's unflappable demeanor. The moderator, caught off guard by the intensity, tried to intervene. "Let's keep this civil, senators," he said, but his words were drowned out by the crowd's reaction. Social media was exploding with clips of Kennedy's hush comment going viral within minutes. Hashtags like Kennedy owns Warren and Hush heard round. The world began trending, and viewers posted memes of Kennedy's calm smile juxtaposed with Warren's angry outburst. Warren's advisors, watching from the control room, were in a panic, realizing their candidate had lost control. Kennedy, meanwhile, sat back, his hands folded, looking like a man who knew he'd just won the round. The producers, sensing the ratings' potential, signaled to keep the cameras rolling, knowing they were capturing a moment that would dominate the news cycle. Warren tried one last time to reclaim the narrative, her voice strained but forceful. "The American people deserve better than sound bites," she said, glaring at Kennedy. "They deserve leaders who understand the complexities of our economy and have the courage to fix it." But Kennedy was ready with a final blow. "And they deserve leaders who can talk to them without a PhD in economics," he said, his voice steady and commanding. "Folks want someone who gets their struggles, not someone who's gonna bury them in paperwork." The crowd's applause was deafening, and Warren's shoulders slumped slightly, her energy drained by the relentless pace of Kennedy's attacks. The moderator, realizing the segment was spiraling, called for a commercial break, giving both senators a moment to catch their breath. As the cameras panned away, Kennedy leaned back, his expression one of quiet confidence, while Warren stared at her notes, her face a mask of frustration and disbelief. The second round of the debate had been a masterclass in Kennedy's ability to control the narrative, using his wit and relatability to outmaneuver Warren's data-driven approach. He'd turned her strengths into liabilities, exposing her inability to connect with the audience on a human level. Warren, caught off guard by his directness and rattled by his hush comment, had let her emotions get the better of her, a mistake that would haunt her in the hours and days to come. The stage was now Kennedy's, and the audience, both in the studio and at home, knew it. As the show cut to commercial, social media continued to explode, with Kennedy's supporters celebrating his dominance and Warren's allies scrambling to salvage her reputation. The clash had reached its peak, and the fallout was about to begin, setting the stage for a reckoning that would reshape how both senators were perceived. The studio lights dimmed as the debate cut to its final commercial break, but the electricity in the room lingered like the aftershock of a storm. Senator John Kennedy, the Louisiana Republican, whose sharp wit and unrelenting focus had dominated the night, sat calmly at the debate table. His hands folded, a faint smile hinting at his satisfaction. Across from him, Senator Elizabeth Warren, the Massachusetts Democrat, known for her fierce advocacy, looked visibly shaken. Her notes scattered before her as she tried to process the unraveling of her carefully planned performance. The audience, still buzzing from the explosive exchange where Kennedy had told Warren to hush, was now whispering among themselves, their reactions a mix of awe at Kennedy's command and shock at Warren's loss of composure. Social media was ablaze with clips of Kennedy's defining moment, racking up millions of views, while hashtags like Kennedy owns Warren and Hush heard round the world dominated every platform. The debate had been a spectacle, but as the cameras prepared to roll for the final segment, it was clear that the real impact would be felt in the aftermath, a reckoning that would reshape public perception of both senators and leave lasting lessons for anyone watching. When the broadcast resumed, the moderator, clearly aware of the historic moment unfolding, tried to steer the conversation back to policy. Senators, let's wrap up with your closing thoughts on how to balance economic growth with fiscal responsibility, he said, his tone measured but tinged with excitement. Warren, determined to salvage her performance, took a deep breath and leaned forward, her voice steadier but still carrying the strain of the earlier clash. The American people deserve an economy that works for them, not just the wealthy, she began, her hands gesturing more cautiously now. My plan to close corporate tax loopholes and invest in infrastructure will create jobs and reduce inequality based on sound economic evidence. We can't keep relying on trickle-down policies that haven't delivered for decades. Her words were earnest, but the passion she'd shown earlier was muted, as if the weight of Kennedy's attacks had dulled her fire. The audience listened politely, but their energy had shifted. They were waiting for Kennedy, the man who'd stolen the show with his plain-spoken brilliance. Kennedy, sensing his moment to seal the victory, leaned into the camera with the ease of a seasoned storyteller. Folks, I'm not here to throw around fancy numbers or lecture you about what's in some Washington report, he said, his Louisiana drawl wrapping around each word like a warm handshake. I'm here to talk about you, the folks working 2 jobs, the small business owners keeping their doors open, the parents saving for their kids' future. Our tax cuts put more money in your pockets, and that's what keeps this economy moving. Senator Warren's plans sound nice in a classroom, but out here in the real world they're just gonna make life harder for the people I'm fighting for. The crowd erupted in applause louder than at any other point in the night, and Kennedy leaned back, his expression one of quiet triumph. The contrast couldn't have been clearer. Warren's academic approach had faltered, while Kennedy's relatable, no-nonsense style had won the room and the viewers at home. As the moderator thanked the senators and wrapped the show, the cameras lingered on their contrasting demeanors. Kennedy calm and confident, Warren visibly deflated, gathering her notes with a tight-lipped expression. The studio audience filed out their conversations, a mix of admiration for Kennedy's performance and debate about Warren's unraveling. Behind the scenes, the production team was already tallying the social media metrics, their screens showing a flood of engagement unlike anything the network had seen in years. Clips of Kennedy's hush moment were shared millions of times within hours, with memes and reaction videos spreading like wildfire. Comments like "Kennedy spoke for all of us" and "Warren got schooled" filled every platform, while Warren's supporters struggled to counter the narrative, their posts drowned out by the sheer volume of Kennedy's newfound fans. The debate had been a turning point, not just for the senators, but for the way political discourse was perceived. In the hours and days that followed, the fallout was swift and unforgiving. Kennedy emerged as a hero to millions, his performance celebrated as a masterclass in connecting with everyday Americans. News outlets ran headlines like "Kennedy's Common Sense Victory" and "Louisiana Senator Shines in Debate Showdown," praising his ability to distill complex issues into relatable truths. His social media following surged, with thousands of new followers quoting his one-liners and sharing clips of his best moments. Conservative commentators hailed him as a voice for the working class, while even some moderate viewers admitted they'd been won over by his authenticity. Kennedy's team, watching the numbers roll in, knew they'd struck gold. They quickly capitalized on the momentum, scheduling follow-up interviews where Kennedy continued to hammer home his message of simplicity and pragmatism. In one appearance, he quipped, "Folks don't need a lecture, they need someone who's gonna fight for their paycheck." The line became an instant hit, further cementing his status as a political rock star. Warren, meanwhile, faced a barrage of criticism that threatened to overshadow her years of advocacy. Pundits dissected her performance, pointing to her loss of composure as a fatal flaw. Warren's outburst showed she can't handle pressure, one analyst wrote, while another noted she let Kennedy get under her skin, and it cost her. Her supporters tried to rally, arguing that her policy expertise deserved respect, but the narrative had shifted. Social media was merciless, with memes mocking her reaction to Kennedy's hush comment and questioning her ability to stay cool under fire. Her team scrambled to do damage control, booking her on friendly talk shows to clarify her positions, but the appearances felt forced, her usual fire dampened by the lingering sting of the debate. In one interview, she admitted, "I let my emotions get the better of me, but I stand by the facts." The admission was honest, but it did little to stem the tide of negative headlines. Warren's approval ratings dipped particularly among independents who'd been swayed by Kennedy's relatable style. The broader impact of the debate rippled through the political landscape. Kennedy's performance became a case study for aspiring politicians, with analysts praising his ability to turn a policy debate into a conversation with the American people. His team released a montage of his best moments set to upbeat music, which racked up millions of views online. Political strategists began advising clients to emulate Kennedy's approach. Keep it simple, stay calm, and never underestimate the power of a well-timed quip. Warren's team, meanwhile, conducted a post-mortem, realizing they'd underestimated Kennedy's ability to connect with audiences. They advised her to incorporate more relatable stories in future appearances, but the damage was done. Her reputation as a formidable debater had taken a hit, and she faced an uphill battle to regain the public's trust. The debate also sparked a broader conversation about the state of political discourse. Commentators noted that Kennedy's success highlighted a growing demand for authenticity over academic rhetoric. "Voters are tired of being lectured," one pundit remarked. Kennedy spoke to their reality, and that's why he won. The viral nature of the debate clips underscored the power of social media in shaping public perception, with Kennedy's hush moment becoming a cultural touchstone. Late-night comedians incorporated it into their monologues, while political podcasts dissected every angle of the exchange. The debate wasn't just a moment, it was a phenomenon that reshaped how politicians approached the public stage. For Kennedy, the aftermath was a triumph that elevated his national profile. Invitations poured in for speaking engagements, and his team fielded calls from party leaders eager to align with his rising star. He remained gracious, never gloating about his victory, but instead doubling down on his message of fighting for everyday Americans. In a follow-up interview, he said, "I'm just trying to talk to folks the way I'd talk to my neighbors back home. That's what this is all about." His humility only added to his appeal, solidifying his image as a politician who understood the pulse of the nation. Warren, reflecting on the debacle, faced a moment of reckoning. Her advisors urged her to adapt, to find ways to connect with audiences beyond policy papers and statistics. In private, she acknowledged that Kennedy's approach had exposed a weakness in her style. "I need to meet people where they are," she told her team, a rare admission of vulnerability. She began working with communication coaches to refine her delivery, but the road to recovery was long. The debate had dented her reputation, and she knew she'd need to rebuild trust with voters who'd seen her falter. The lessons from the debate were clear, and they carried weight far beyond the studio. First, staying calm under pressure was paramount. Kennedy's unflappable demeanor had allowed him to control the narrative, while Warren's emotional reaction had undermined her credibility. Second, effective communication meant speaking to people's lived experiences, not just their intellect. Kennedy's ability to distill complex issues into relatable terms had won over the audience, while Warren's reliance on data had left her isolated. Third preparation was everything. Kennedy's strategic foresight had given him the upper hand, while Warren's team had failed to anticipate his tactics. Finally, respect even in the heat of debate mattered. Kennedy's hush comment, while effective, had sparked debate about civility, reminding everyone that sharp words could cut both ways. For viewers, especially young people watching the debate unfold, the lessons were a call to action. Kennedy's performance showed that authenticity and clarity could triumph over complexity, inspiring a new generation of communicators to prioritize connection over credentials. For aspiring leaders, the debate was a reminder to know your audience, to prepare for every angle, and to never let emotions derail your message. The night had been a turning point, not just for Kennedy and Warren, but for anyone who valued the art of persuasion. As the dust settled, one thing was certain: John Kennedy had redefined what it meant to win a debate, and his victory would echo long after the studio lights went dark.